And hello once again, my name is Lupus, and today I'm going to be talking about animal studies. So before we get into that, if you appreciate these videos that I make, and I've made a whole bunch of these videos, and you want to support me, you can check out my Patreon, or you can buy some of my books. But we're going to move on to animal studies for now and talk about that later. So, animal studies. What is animal studies? Now, first off, let me just say, animal studies is kind of my main area. My education is in theory of literature, but my predominant area of focus within that is animal studies. So essentially the depiction, representation and such of animals in media. And animal studies is a very, very broad term that refers to a lot of these interrelated areas that all sort of, work with one another. They're interrelated. So let me first just say here that animal studies is not zoology. I put that here at the very, very top. Animal studies is not zoology. Zoology is literally the study of animals, like physically, biologically. You'll be learning about how animals actually function within the world, and that is not what animal studies is. Animal studies is more of a philosophical overall concept, and is looking at how humans interact with animals, why we interact the way that we do, the relationships that we have with one another, the mental ideas that we have with relation to them, the sort of philosophical underpinnings of how we see animals, and all that kind of jazz. Okay, so an important thing, if you're interested in animal studies and you want to, or you're interested in learning what this animal studies thing is and why it might be interesting to you, and why it was so interesting to me, is understanding some major concepts that you would look at if you were wanting to go into this as a possible area of study. So, what is the animal? Now, this is essentially a central concept within animal studies, because defining what an animal is and what actually separates an animal from other things is very, very important, because it can actually be a lot more complicated than you might think. You might just think, oh, no, well, an animal's an animal. No, but what is an animal? And also, of course, the differentiation between animals and humans. What makes a human different from an animal? Now, obviously, from a purely biological perspective, humans are animals. So that's actually why we like to use the term in animal studies, non-human animals, most of the time, because non-human animals signifies basically the animals that are not humans. However, there are certain difficulties that come into play, especially when it comes to things like, say, critical plant studies. And critical plant studies is an area I find very, very interesting, which shows how plants are actually a lot more responsive than we think they are a lot of the time. Plants are not just inanimate little objects that have no kind of sense of the world around them. You can't really say they have consciousness in the sense that, animals like humans and dogs and what have you do, but they do have a kind of stimulus response to the world, and some are maybe a bit more what you might call conscious than others. And that is interesting, because that sort of makes it harder and harder to define the animal. What is the animal? Because whenever you try and define the animal, it kind of always includes humans, right? Because it's a biological creature that usually has some kind of a functioning that is tied to that biological aspect. Obviously, different types of animals are defined in different ways based on certain characteristics. Humans are mammals, right? Which means we have, warm blood, and we are we give birth to live young, and some other things. For instance, we have fur and skin. We have an endoskeleton. Or endoskeleton rather than an exoskeleton. Whereas, if you look at bugs, they have an exoskeleton. If you look at something like reptiles, right, they're cold-blooded, they lay eggs. A lot of creatures do lay eggs, and they're not mammals, but they are still animals. And then you get some things which cause some difficulties, like, say, a lot of fungi, mushrooms and such. They're not plants, but they're not animals. They also seem to have a much more intricate consciousness, or what you might be able to call a consciousness, than most plants. They're more intelligent than most plants, but they're not animals. A mushroom is not an animal, but it's not a plant. And then also, of course, when it comes to just plants, you're usually defining things by, plants, for instance, don't move, but there are some plants that do move. Animals are able to communicate, but some plants are also able to communicate. And this is also where you get into the more difficult discussion of the difference between humans and animals, because there's this idea of sort of difference in kind and difference in degree, right? Where there aren't really any differences in sort of type between humans and animals, because there are rather differences in degree. Animals have consciousness, humans have consciousness, but we usually say that humans have more consciousness. Animals have intelligence, humans have intelligence, but humans have more intelligence. And then we usually try to have specific things that we can differentiate. So we'll say, well, humans have language. And that usually is because we have a very, very narrow definition of what language is. And so we say, we have this narrow definition, except that even that narrow definition some animals have. For instance, having syntax and specific vocabulary, which can be found in things like dolphins, which will also have specific syntax and specific syntax and grammar and such, which is language. So, and that's why we also like to have this thing where we say, no, humans have language, animals just have communication. But language is communication. You're just narrowly defining it so that you can exclude animals. And you look at a lot of other things. You'll say, okay, well, humans have a sense of justice. Except that some animals have also been noted to have a sense of justice, to understand injustice. Some animals understand ethical considerations. Not all of them, but some do. Also, we have done things like, say, for instance, we have taught sign language to some primates, and they've been able to communicate, which then some people would say, oh, they're just like sort of rote memorization of things, except that some have exhibited the ability to combine things outside of what they were definitively taught, which means that they're able to reason these concepts out and to figure things out, which then further sort of says, well, humans do that too, right? So all of these things are everything we try and say, humans are the ones that do this. We will be able to find an animal that can also do it, just not as well. So that's why there's sort of this difference in type, difference in category, which we don't really have. That's sort of saying, we have language. Some animals also have language, and most have communication of some kind, so it depends on how you define it. But difference in kind, not difference in kind, difference in degree is very different, because the difference in degree will sort of say, we have more sophisticated language than they do, which, yes, we do. We have the most sophisticated language on the planet, right? We are much more sophisticated in terms of that, and much more intelligent in terms of most of the characterizations of what intelligence is. We have more of it than animals. So that is something important to keep in mind, right? We do have this difference in degree, right? We have a higher degree of intelligence, a higher degree of consciousness, a higher degree of ethical consideration, but we are not necessarily the only ones that have that thing. But that makes it, the differentiation between animals and humans, much, much harder to do. And that is why you also get certain arguments that you'll find. This is like a very, very baseline argument in animal studies. This is an extremely common one. You'll always encounter this. Like, I swear, when you've read enough animal studies books, they will all bring up the argument against like marginal cases. They'll always bring that, because whenever you try to say, oh, well, humans have language. Not all humans have language, though. So if you're trying to use that as a way of differentiating, or saying humans are intelligent, humans have the ability to reason. Yes, but not all humans have the ability to reason. Like, okay, if you were to say, well, animals can't reason, but not all humans can reason. Very, very young humans, or senile humans, or humans with mental disabilities cannot reason, but they are still human. So then people would usually say, oh, well, it's optimal functioning of a human. Yeah, but then that is, if you were to say, oh, but optimal functioning of a human is able to have language. And you say, yes, but optimal functioning is now a value judgment that you are making. You are saying that there is a correct way to be human, which is inherently discriminatory. That means that you are saying certain people do not classify as full humans. So that is a problem. And that is a thing that you can look at in animal studies, because the differentiation between animals and humans is actually much more complicated. Okay, but let's move on from this, because this is mostly just going to be an overview of things. I'm not going in depth into things. So the next thing is connections between animals and the environment. All right, that is a thing you'll also find in a lot of animal studies, because things like eco-criticism, ecofeminism, ecology, environmentalism, these are all often also found in animal studies, because most animals do live in what we designate as the wild, right? Because you get animals that are essentially designated wild, you get animals that are designated as domesticated, and animals that are set as feral, right? These are different: wild, feral, and domesticated. Because wild, they're in the wild. They're wild animals. domesticated, they live with us, and then feral is that they live with us, but they're not climatized to us specifically. So think of like a cat that lives with a person versus a cat that lives on the street, that was raised on the street, that does not have human companionship, but they might, because they are so used to seeing humans, they have a relationship with humans. So that is a thing that you can take into account to look at how humans, animals, all of these things relate to the environment and how the environment relates back to us. So by caring about animals, you kind of have to care about the environment as well. You can't just differentiate. You can't just sort of say, oh, I care about animals, but I don't care about the environment. Because most of the animals are in sort of the wild. We all live in the environment. A city is still the environment. It's just that we have altered it, right? Because if you were to say, there's a difference between nature and the city. And yes, strictly speaking, I suppose you could make that differentiation, but where was the city built? Was it built in a place where the wild never was? It might have been a very long time ago. You might say, well, Rome is thousands upon thousands of years old. But before Rome was built, what was there? There was nature, which was then turned into a city. And that is something that's very important to keep in mind, is that even if you would try to say that there is a differentiation between animals and the environment and like cities and stuff like that, there's not really. These differentiations become harder and harder to justify. So that is something important to keep in mind when it comes to animal studies, if you want to look into it. Now also, this is a very interesting thing, which I've kind of spoken about before, is the differences between biological reality and social construction. Now, biological reality is just saying these are the things that are biologically factual, and then social construction is what has been created by humans mentally, right? So, take for instance, there is the biological reality that different animals have different classifications. However, it is a social construction that we've put them into these classifications, or rather, I phrase that poorly. The animals are different to one another, and then we have put them into classifications based on arbitrary standards that we have created. So let's have a look at something like, say, the classification of mammal, right? Mammal comes from, it has mammary glands. That's where the word comes from, right? It produces milk. That is what makes it. However, we've added a couple other things to there, right? We said they're also warm-blooded. They give birth to live young. They provide milk. That is what a mammal is. And then a platypus comes along, a duck-billed platypus comes along, which is a mammal, but it has a duck's bill, right? So it has like a bird's face, and it lays eggs, and also it has a poisonous spur. So it also basically has poison, which is not something that, mammals have. So all of a sudden this thing messes with the entire classification system that we've had. But it is still it gives birth to furry little animals, and fur is also something that's usually on mammals, and it feeds it milk, but it's born from an egg. And also, of course, the idea of something not being born from an egg. Everything is actually born from an egg. It's just that some eggs develop inside the animal and some develop outside the animal. We as humans also have eggs, right? The ovum is an egg, which is then fertilized by a sperm, which is then develops inside, and essentially the egg is inside the mother until it eventually gives birth, right? But it is still functionally an egg that is then fertilized, but it stays inside. So instead of having a separate egg, the egg develops inside. But it is still ultimately an egg structure. It's still the same sort of thing. So it's still being born in the same kind of way, just differently. So how do you decide what is biological reality and what is social construction? The concept of a mammal is a social construction, but the biological realities of animals is biological, right? These animals have these characteristics, but when we try to lump them into a specific group, that is us imposing our will onto the natural world. Because what happens, for instance, when we say there are only a certain number of categories, what happens when we now encounter a life form that we have never encountered before, that does not fall into any of the categories we have done before? Now all of a sudden we have to create a new category to understand that, even though the biological reality was that that thing always existed. What happens when we find a creature that doesn't give birth through like an egg or like in the traditional sense? What if it's not a mammal, and it's not a bird, and it's not a reptile, it's something else? What happens then? What do we call it? Because now we have to come up with a new socially constructed label to apply to that particular creature. So social construction is also about the things like animal intelligence. How do you define intelligence? Because intelligence itself is a social construct. Intelligence was made up by people. Because people, like, probably the most famously made up nonsense thing about intelligence is the concept of IQ. IQ is not real. IQ is something that was made up by people, because IQ, just as a quick little aside here, IQ is supposedly an objective measurement of intelligence. However, that would mean that no matter how many times you took an IQ test, it should stay the same, shouldn't it? Because it's supposed to be your innate intelligence. However, you can study for an IQ test. If you can study for it, then it means it's not a test of objective intelligence. If you can study for it and do better at it, or worse at it, depending on how much you studied, then it's not real. And also, if you take it at different times of day, you can get different marks. If you redo an IQ test, you'll get a different score, which means that it's not an objective measurement of intelligence. It is made up by people. We have just decided that that is what intelligence is. Whereas we'll say the same thing about animals. Well, animals can't do this, 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 and this, which therefore means that they're not intelligent. But that's an arbitrary distinction about, I could say something like this. I could say, everybody who cannot speak this language is stupid. That is arbitrary. I've just decided that whoever can't speak this language is stupid. If I say, everyone who can't do maths is stupid, everybody who can't do insert name of whatever is stupid. If you are defining it like that, you're sort of saying who is intelligent and who is not intelligent based on some arbitrary thing in the world, then you can make anything be intelligence or not intelligence. So you can just change what it means to be intelligent. And so when we say look at an animal that is able to determine when and when they should not be cautious of something, we'll usually just say, oh, that's instinct rather than intelligence. But what makes something intelligence versus instinct? What makes it definitively different? And the problem is, if you can argue about what a word means and how it can be applied, then that means it is not a fact. If you can argue about it, it's not a fact. Like, people who try to argue against, say, gravity. If you push something and it falls over, the reality is that when you pushed it, it fell over. If you're trying to now argue that that didn't happen, you're doing it in bad faith. Whereas, if you and I have a difference of opinion about what it means to be intelligent, that means that it's not actually factual. Whereas, if I drop something, it falls, we both see the exact same thing, but you tell me that it didn't fall, then you are lying, which is not the same thing as having an argument in good faith, like it would be with social constructions. Alright, so that's just a little bit there. The next thing I spoke about here is the importance of language in animal studies. Very important. Language is so important because what we call something determines how we see it. And also, of course, just literally whether or not animals have language, which usually, when we talk about language in terms of, in an exclusionary sense, we will say that humans have language because of some arbitrary signifier. We'll say, well, humans, I hiccuped again. Well, again, I hiccuped in a previous recording. Anyway, when we sort of say, oh, animals cannot speak, well, they can understand each other. They're able to communicate with each other. And also, we can communicate with a lot of animals. You're able to communicate with a dog. When a dog learns their own name, or the different words that people always say, well, they don't actually learn their name. They learn the sounds that mean you want them, that you address them with. But how is that definitively different from what human beings do? I have heard my name said to me so many times that when I hear my name, even if it's not addressed to me, I will look up. Think about how if you've been in like a bank or something, or a place where they're calling out the names of people, and you hear your name being said, you will immediately, instinctively be like, yes? That's because you've been trained to hear that word and associate it with yourself. Like, how is that definitively different from an animal doing the same thing, right? They have a much lower capacity. So, say a dog has a much lower capacity for learning vocabulary, but they do learn these words. They learn what certain words mean in relation to how it affects them. There's a reason, for instance, that a dog never has to learn what rent is, because dogs don't pay rent. So why would it matter, right? If something falls within the creature's experience, then it will be able to understand something with relation to that. Not all of them, obviously. Different animals have different ways of interpreting the world, have different understandings of communication, and whatever. Different animals, different relationships, different way of thinking. That is just so obvious that I don't even really see the point in harping on about it. So I'm just going to move on for now. But yeah, language is very important and very interesting to talk about. Now, the representation of animals is also very important. How do we show animals in media? And not just in media, but also how do we represent animals in like thought, like in non-fiction, in philosophy, in science? How do we represent animals? It's so important because if we represent animals as intelligent, people are more likely to see those traits in the animals that they see. Whereas if we represent them as stupid, you're going to probably see those traits too. The representation of animals is very important. Think about how, for instance, there is this idea based on really, really poor representation of domesticated dogs that certain dog breeds are unsafe dog breeds. They're dangerous dog breeds, which isn't actually true. If a dog is raised in a good environment, they won't do that thing. I have seen, for instance, pit bulls. I've seen pit bulls that are violent, and I've seen pit bulls that are the sweetest animals you'll ever meet in your life and would never hurt anyone. And that doesn't have to do with, oh, it's a bad breed. That has to do with usually how it was raised. And also, like for instance, when you get these things of like a dog mauling someone, a lot of the time, those dogs, it's kind of like with serial killers. Something bad happened to that animal. Not always, obviously. Sometimes there might be something just wrong with an animal. Just like there might be something wrong with a human. We don't even know why. Serial killer is probably a great example, right? A lot of serial killers came from really bad environments. They came from bad homes. They might have been abused. But not all of them. So you can't just say being abused equals becoming a serial killer, because some people become a serial killer. Some people just move on with their lives. Some have trauma. Some don't have trauma. You don't know. It's almost as if the brain is more complex than some people want to pretend that it is, including the brains of animals, right? For instance, we have a bunch of dogs here with us. I do not like the term own because I see them as sentient creatures that have their own lives. We are their caretakers. That's sort of how I view the animals that we have essentially adopted. Now, the different dogs act differently. They have different personalities. When I look at two of these dogs, right, if I raise my hand, not to hit them, if I raise it for a different reason, they get scared because they're also rescues. I don't know what happened to them earlier in their life. I don't know what happened to them before I met them. Whereas our other little puppy, she's not actually a puppy anymore, but like she's like 2 or 3, I don't even know, but she's not a puppy anymore, but she's still a puppy. We got her when she was literally still a puppy. Okay, she was like 6 weeks, maybe even younger. I don't know. We shouldn't have had her as young. I don't think we should have had her, but they were literally throwing the dogs away, so we took one that we could to try and give her a good life. She, if you raise your hand or anything, she thinks it's just play because she has no negative associations. She doesn't see it as, oh, this is like someone's going to hit me. She sees it as, oh, it's playtime now. Because we don't know about those other dogs. We don't know if they were abused before we got them, but we know that this little girl wasn't. We know this little puppy, she definitely wasn't because she was with us from the beginning. Her formative years were with us. She was never abused. So she's not afraid. She's never afraid. Whereas the other dogs get afraid when you do things. Right? Because it's almost as if they had different lives. And so the way you represent these animals in media can show a lot and demonstrate a lot. My MA dissertation was literally about the depiction of anthropomorphic animals in media. It was an analysis of a manga/anime called Beastars. And there I looked at the representation of animals and how animals are shown, how meat is shown, how gender is shown. I went into all of these things because I found it very interesting. So the representation of animals is something you can look at. When I did actually my honors, and I first did some animal study stuff, I looked at the works of Jack London. The Call of the Wild and White Fang, which both looked at sort of domestic, wild, and feral animals, and how you can depict them. And that was very interesting. So these are the sorts of things that you can do if you want to look at animal studies. Now the next one, I say, is definitions of intelligence and instinct. I kind of already went into this, actually. Spoke about this before. But like, what is intelligence and what is instinct? These are important things to also note. So I'm just going to move over this one because I kind of have already spoken about it. Now, the last thing I just said here is animal ethics and the plight of non-human animals. I've actually made a whole bunch of videos about this, so I'm not really going to go in depth into it. But when you go into animal studies, you'll also often go into animal ethics in all the major fields. So, deontological ethics, virtue ethics, utilitarian ethics. I also did care ethics. I've done a bunch of videos going over each of those, and I've also done a video called What We Do to Animals, which goes into like the plight of non-human animals. So I'm not going to go into it here, but basically there's a lot of things we do to animals, a lot of things that we can also understand about, the unethical ways that we treat animals, and that is something that is very, very commonly interrogated in animal studies. But I'm not going to really talk about it here because I've made like hours of videos about that before, so you can go check that out instead. And so yeah, that's kind of just an introduction to animal studies for those who might be interested in looking into it. So yeah, I hope that it was interesting, enlightening, or whatever these kinds of words that you might want to use. If it wasn't, I'm sorry. I apologize. But yeah, if you appreciate these kind of videos that I do and you would like to support them, you can check out my Patreon or you can check out my books. Whatever you want to do. But hopefully you did enjoy it. Hopefully it's at least somewhat educational. So, yeah. And if you don't want to do those more monetarily supporting things, you can also do something else, which would be like liking, subscribing, commenting, those kinds of things. All very, very useful. So, yeah. That's about it. Otherwise, I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and goodbye.